Members, if I was to do a count, I would say that we don't have quorum, and as a quorum of members are not being present, we will ring the bells until we get the numbers. Thank you. Feel free to text somebody. We need one. Thank you, members. Now we have quorum. I would ask that you stand in silence and pray or reflect on our responsibilities of the people of the Australian Capital Territory. Thank you, members. Clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 1.
Ms Lauder.
I move the motion standing in my name on the notice paper about development of the Red Hill open space area.
The question is that that motion be agreed to, that question be agreed to, Ms Lauder.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to bring to the attention of the Assembly today the community concerns around proposal at the Federal Golf Club. The Canberra Liberals hope that the ACT Government will ensure that any development that's undertaken at the Federal Golf Club is of sound quality and respects the current built nature and the current environmental concerns around the area. And today I'd like to talk on a couple of issues. Why the Federal Golf Club is important from a planning perspective, what the current planning concerns and issues are, the involvement of community groups, including the Canberra Community Clubs Group and the community panel process, how development applications are usually handled, and then I'll talk about why I've brought forward this motion today, what I'm calling on the government to do, and why. It's probably important to address the context of this by providing some background. And since 1998, the Federal Golf Club has been exploring ways that the golf club can diversify and ensure continued cash flow into the years ahead. In 1999, Territory Plan Variation 94, which would have allowed development at the golf club, was disallowed by the Assembly as it was inconsistent with the Territory Plan because the impact on formal and formal open space areas. In 2007, the then Planning Minister, Mr Barr, promised to consider the proposal again, as there were considerable financial concerns surrounding the Federal Golf Club and their ability to navigate their way through the prolonged drought. However, in 2011, Minister Barr rejected the proposal, stating that, and I quote, he'd formed this view after careful consideration of the advice and opinions of a range of government agencies, environmental and community groups. In December 2014, the Federal Golf Club proposed a seniors living development on their Red Hill land. Madam Speaker, most of us probably know the Federal Golf Club is positioned on the southern side of Red Hill. It's bounded by the suburbs of Garran and Hughes. It could be an important area for suburban infill, but it is in a bushfire zone. Madam Speaker, over the past 19 years, the community and the Federal Golf Club have had their differences with regard to future development. This isn't a secret. Concerns being raised by community members have been many and varied. They include the fact that Section 66 is a highly sensitive and significant area located on the slopes of Red Hill, that the Red Hill area contains remnants of the significantly endangered red gum yellow box woodland. The proposed development could have a detrimental impact on recreational activities in the area, and the impact on local amenities, including lack of road access. While the Federal Golf Club have been calling to be allowed to develop their current lease so they can further drought-proof their golf course, upgrade the clubhouse, which is a bit rusty and outdated, and they can provide financial security into the future. But that doesn't mean that community concerns aren't equally important so that we can have certainty for all parties going forward. We don't want to have another 20-year period where every 5 years local community groups and the golf club go at loggerheads with each other over yet another proposal. Many people have questioned the government's involvement in the current development proposal. It's no secret that because Clubs ACT backed the Canberra Liberals at the last election, this government have now refused to deal with Clubs ACT. Mr Barr has publicly said he won't meet with Clubs ACT. Mr Ramsey has publicly said he won't meet with Clubs ACT. Instead, the government will only deal with the CFMEU-backed tradies-run Canberra community clubs. In July 2017, the Federal Golf Club left Clubs ACT and went to the CFMEU-backed Canberra Community Clubs group. And at that time, Scott Elias, the General Manager of the Federal Golf Club, said publicly, "The government will talk to them. As far as I'm aware, the government won't talk to Clubs ACT. It basically comes down to what's in the best interests of the club to get that development through. We want to get it through this time and we will do everything we can." 3 weeks after the announcement of the defection of the Federal Golf Club to the CFMEU-backed Community Clubs Group, the government set up the one-off community panel for consultation on the proposal. This panel discussion was by invitation only, with even MLAs only to attend a very small part of those meetings. Members of the panel included the Federal Golf Club, the developer, Embark, the National Capital Authority, the ACT Government Architect, heritage representatives, the Conservation Council of the ACT, the Friends of Grasslands, the Red Hill Regenerators, 3 local resident groups, the Inner South Canberra Community Council, and the Council on the Ageing and the Canberra Business Chamber. This quite hastily put together one-off community panel. When I say one-off, Mr Barr was quoted as saying this was a one-off panel, which locks people and MLAs out, makes it seem like the outcome of the community panel, and I'm referring to emails I've received from community groups here, it makes it seem like the outcome of the community panel is a fait accompli, that the consultation was a sham, and that the government have already decided to back this development application. In a briefing that I had from the Directorate earlier this week, I was told that all the community groups were happy. They felt it was the best proposal that had been put forward, and they'd received comments such as good as they've seen. The Directorate, however, didn't finish the sentences. The community groups provided me with their version of what was said at that panel meeting that incidentally I was locked out of. I was invited, I RSVP'd, and when I turned up on the night, I was unable to get in the locked door. It was quite unfortunate. Quite unfortunate from many points, not least of which I could have perhaps gone to another event or even better stayed at home with my family. Instead of driving half an hour to get there, spending half an hour knocking on the door and another half an hour to drive home. Complete waste of time. Not one of the community councils that I've spoken to are happy with the outcome of the panel. Some of the comments I've received from community group members include There's a strong view by many of the community group members of the community panel that the direction of the panel was being taken by EPSDD has degenerated to a point where the whole process is a farce that is blatantly supporting the FGC proposal. A farce, Madam Speaker. EPSD, this is another quote, EPSD has consistently protected FGC, Federal Golf Club, and its developer from requests for meaningful information to be supplied on the ridiculous premise that all will be revealed later in the DA. So, community groups, I guess, are confused by the intent of the panel. They thought they would have the opportunity to put forward their views and have feedback provided. They thought they would be able to ask questions and get answers. They thought that they would be able to ask for data and have that data provided. This, Madam Speaker, is not what has taken place. And some of those representatives of the community groups are here in the gallery today. It doesn't take into account that what we need here in this Red Hill open space area is a holistic approach to planning in the area, not looking at the Federal Golf Club proposal in isolation, then looking at another proposal in Kent Street, Hughes or Deakin. What we need to think of is a holistic approach that takes into account, for example, the significant environmental concerns of the area, not just one development application at a time. This piecemeal approach that's being taken to planning in the area could cause significant damage to the area. There are still concerns around access to the Federal Golf Club in terms of car access and public transport, the need to upgrade Gowrie Drive and the increase in traffic flow and further congestion. Now, DAs are usually handled in a particular way. In this case, it's been quite different because of this one-off panel that has been created by the government. And after 3 meetings, Madam Speaker, 3 meetings of this panel and community representatives were willing and expecting to continue to meet when it was unceremoniously come to a halt by the government representative, who said there was no need for further meetings. They'd collected all of the residents' concerns and they would now be addressed in the development application. Usually, for an impact track development application, an applicant lodges a development application, ACTPLA refer the DA to entity and issue public notifications, ACTPLA request further information if required, ACTPLA assesses the DA against the territory plan, environmental impact statement and relevant codes, and ACTPLA makes its decision. This case has been very different. What we need to see here, Madam Speaker, is stability to end years of protracted debate in the community. The community panel members, many of them, I think perhaps the majority, asked about a master plan process for the Red Hill open space area. And whilst in the strictest sense of the definition of a master plan, that may not be the best approach or the approach that the government will take, it doesn't mean that the concept of a more integrated and holistic plan shouldn't take place in this area. We need a holistic approach to developing the Red Hill open space area that takes into account the implication of all or any development in the area, that reviews and looks at the existing green space in the area and protects it if that's what's required. And residents certainly believe that protection of the green space in their areas is vital. We need to consider the best way to protect the Red Hill Nature Reserve. And most importantly, and this is something that I've spoken about in this Assembly time and time again with relation to planning matters, we need an open consultation process with the community, not one that truncates when the government feels they've collected enough information to enable them to move forward. It's something that's transparent and genuinely, Madam Speaker, enables residents to feel that their views and their concerns have been heard. The government, I'm sure, will say that master plans are for group centres and key transport areas only. But it's the concept of a master plan that we're asking for here, whether you want to call it something different than a master plan. But the concept of an integrated approach that looks at the entire area, not one DA at a time. So the motion that I've moved today, Madam Speaker, can provide a path forward to give some certainty and transparency to the Red Hill community and for the Federal Golf Club. It's a forward-looking plan for all of the Red Hill open space area, a long-term approach with a vision. And that's why my motion today is calling on the ACT Government to refer the overall planning of the Red Hill open space to the Planning and Urban Renewal Committee and to suspend all or any development activity in the Red Hill open space area until the committee report and the government response has been received and made available publicly. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, I hope that the ACT Government will ensure that any development that may be undertaken at the Federal Golf Club or indeed anywhere in that Red Hill open space area is of sound quality, respects the environmental impact of the area, takes into account other built structures in the area, and very, very importantly, consults openly and transparently with community members and ensures that their concerns are heard. I commend the motion to the Assembly.
Question is that the motion be agreed to. Mr Gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the government won't be supporting Ms Lauder's motion as it stands, and I have circulated an amendment in my name, and I'll move that amendment now.
I don't believe yours has been. It has? I just haven't seen a copy. I apologise, Mr Gentleman. So
thank you, Madam Speaker.
That your amendment be agreed to.
And just speaking to Ms Lauder's motion and my amendment, it's simply that some of the comments in Ms Lauder's motion and indeed in her speech do cover some inaccuracies that I would like to clarify. And in response to the motion put forward, I'd like to clarify the circumstances surrounding the proposed development at the Federal Golf Club and the community panel process. Madam Speaker, the future development proposal for the site is still in a very formative stage. The proponent has not lodged a development application, nor has the proponent requested to vary the territory plan to deconcessionalise or vary the golf club lease. Madam Speaker, it's in its early days. The Environment Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate offered to convene a community panel to facilitate community engagement about the proposal. This offer was willingly accepted by the proponent and a number of key stakeholder groups in the Red Hill area. All too often, Madam Speaker, I hear complaints that the community and stakeholder groups only have the opportunity to comment on development proposals at the formal statutory application stage. By this time, many key decisions have been made. The intent of the community panel has been to provide key stakeholder groups with an opportunity to inform the development proposal rather than just responding to it. The community panel process does not replace the formal consultation processes in any subsequent development applications, nor does it bind the panel participants or limit their opportunity to lodge public submissions on future development applications. In establishing the community panel, the Directorate's endeavour to bring all the right voices together by specifically inviting known stakeholder groups, including community council, resident groups, environmental groups and non-government organisations such as the Council on the Ageing. Through the course of the panel process, other organisations expressed interest and were welcomed to the panel. This included the Woden Valley Community Council. Madam Speaker, the meetings were initiated by invitation, and this was to ensure that key stakeholders' voices could be heard. However, the meetings were not closed. Observers did attend and were welcomed, and the meeting notes have been progressively placed on the ACT Government Have Your Say website once agreed by panel members. The terms of reference, which were agreed by the panel, are also publicly available on the ACT Government Have Your Say website. This includes a commitment to a 3-month panel period starting on the 3rd of August 2017, with a 3-month period equating to 3 meetings. This allowed sufficient time to ensure all of the right voices were heard, all of the right questions were asked, and that those questions were answered and the answers were robust. The panel discussions were comprehensive and reflected a broad range of interests. It became evident that many panel members had more to say than the meeting times would allow. Accordingly, panel members were invited to lodge further comments after each meeting. These additional comments have been attached to the respective meeting notes and also publicly available on the ACT Government website. Madam Speaker, I'd now like to turn to some of the key factual issues in Ms Lauder's motion. In relation to the motion item 1C, there is no formally designated area called the Red Hill Open Space Area. The Federal Golf Club lease is not zoned open space or any similar term. It is included in the Parks and Recreational PRZ2 Restricted Access Recreation Zone under the Territory Plan. More importantly, the Federal Golf Club lease is zoned urban area under the National Capital Plan, and as you're aware, Madam Speaker, the Territory Plan cannot be inconsistent with the National Capital Plan. Madam Speaker, in relation to motion item 1D, I'd like to clarify that only the fringe areas of the Federal Golf Club lease are within bushfire-prone areas. The area proposed for development is not considered to be bushfire-prone. The panel was advised at its 3rd meeting that the ACT Emergency Services Agency has been separately consulted by the proponent in relation to fire and safety considerations for future development on the site. In regard to motion item 1E, I'd like to reiterate that the Directorate convened the community panel as a pre-consultation process to ensure early sharing of information and identification of issues. Madam Speaker, in relation to motion item 1G, the ACT Planning Strategy promotes residential urban renewal and infill that will increase housing choice in established suburbs to meet the needs of ageing residents to remain within their community. This strategy is due to be reviewed, and it is through this review process that the broader planning considerations are best considered. In relation to motion item 1H, all development proposals are assessed on their planning merits in accordance with the Planning and Development Act 2007. The community panel recommendations, together with the statutory territory plan variation process, provide ample opportunity for the full range of stakeholder interests, development options and potential impacts, including cumulative impacts, to be considered in relation to the Federal Golf Club site and surrounding areas. Madam Speaker, the development proposal in Hughes and Deakin will each be considered both on their merits as individual developments and as part of the broader planning strategy for Canberra to ensure cumulative impacts of these developments is considered. In relation to motion item 1I, the panel process has been conducted in accordance with the agreed terms of reference. The panel was always intended to be conducted over 3 months, equating to 3 meetings. The panel has achieved its purpose and has collected a long list of issues for the club to consider. The panel outcomes will publish a panel report once it has been reviewed by panel members. In regard to motion item 1J, I can confirm that panel members were given a preliminary draft report at the 3rd meeting and were asked to help populate specific content. The draft report has been revised and was circulated to panel members on the 20th of October this year. Madam Speaker, motion item 1K has been reported out of context. The Deputy Director General was responding to comments made by panel members who opposed development on the site. He was citing the specific purpose of a master plan under the ACT planning system and indicated that it was unlikely to suit their stated purpose of preventing development on the Federal Golf Club. The Deputy Director General stands by that comment. In relation to motion item 2A, any future territory plan variation in relation to this proposal would be subject to referral to the Planning and Urban Renewal Committee. A specific inquiry is not necessary. As stated previously, Madam Speaker, the ACT planning strategy is due to be reviewed. It's through this review process that broader planning considerations will be considered. The items raised in the panel discussions will inform future planning considerations. Lastly, in regard to motion item 2B, I note that based on the projects of concern raised by the community, this would prohibit development in an area bounded by Carruthers Street, Kent Street, Adelaide Avenue, Hopetoun Circuit and Gowrie Drive to the Federal Golf Club. It amounts to a moratorium on development, and I consider this to be inappropriate response to open and informative processes. Madam Speaker, I reiterate that the Community Panel recommendations, together with the statutory territory plan variation process, provide ample opportunity for the full range of stakeholder interest, development options and potential impacts, including cumulative impacts, to be considered in relation to the Federal Golf Club site and surrounding areas. I'm very confident that the processes used to inform the community about proposed changes to the Federal Golf Club strongly reflects the ACT Government's commitment to community engagement. The community panel processes should not be cast aside due to a myopic view on how consultation and development can occur. Innovation is an essential component of development as reflected in my statement of planning intent. This means across government, new methods of engaging with the community are needed, and the community panel process provides the opportunity for stakeholder and community input at the earliest stages of development proposals. Not all the community panels will reach consensus, but Madam Speaker, that's no reason to reject them out of hand. The Federal Golf Club Community Panel has raised important planning considerations and it's asked the hard questions up front. It's been publicly documented and I'm satisfied that the panel has achieved one of its purposes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And just a comment, if I could, too, on Ms Lauder's comments to her motion this morning in regard to her comments around Clubs ACT and its members, Madam Speaker. And the government meeting with those members. I certainly met with the Vikings group last week in relation to a meeting for Tuggeranong business owners, so it's not that we have rejected meetings with them. And in regard to her comments about development applications, and I note that Ms Lauder put out a media release this morning citing that the Labor government pushed through the golf club's controversial development plans. I'll state again, Madam Speaker, there is no development application that has been lodged, so it's not hard. It's quite difficult for the government to push forward plans that haven't been lodged. And in relation to her comments about the community panel and being locked out of it, my understanding, Madam Speaker, from our Deputy Director General is that it was due to a staffing error, and the club apologised to Ms Lauder, and so did my Deputy Director General. There was no intention to not lock her out of the meeting at all. And in regard to the last point in Ms Lauder's press release, calling on the government to suspend all development until these integrity issues are resolved, Madam Speaker, there is no development application in process, so we can't call on the government to suspend a development that is not in process, Madam Speaker. So with that, I submit my amendment to the motion.
Question is that Mr Gentleman's amendment be agreed to.
Speak to the amendment.
The amendment, Ms
Thank
Lauder.
you, Madam Speaker. Interesting that Mr Gentleman has talked about a myopic view just then in his speech about his amendment. I noted just yesterday an article in the Riot Act from a former National Capital Development Commissioner who spoke last night to the Deakin Residents Association, and I'll quote a couple of items in this particular article because I think they're very telling and very relevant to the discussion that we're having today about planning matters generally here in the ACT. So, a former National Capital Development Commissioner will tonight, because this was yesterday's article, issue a wake-up call to the ACT's community councils and residents group in a heart-eating speech that accuses the Barr government of corrupting due process and being incompetent. It's from the former NCDC Commissioner, Madam Speaker. I'll just repeat that last bit. Accuses the Barr government of corrupting due process and being incompetent. So last night, the former NCDC Commissioner said, "This is a situation that doesn't occur in the states, as in the states of Australia, where such planning matters, are the responsibility of local councils, in which their planning committees debate and make decisions on both the setting of planning regulations and the approval of development applications at public meetings." A bit later on, the article says that the Environment, Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate is not doing its job properly, is what this article says. And I'll quote, "It doesn't carry out necessary investigations into the community needs to be served, the likelihood of adverse environmental impacts, the compounding effects of multiple development approvals in residential and suburban shopping areas, and the provision of public transport and public parking availability," he was going to say last night. Sounds very similar to some of the items in the motion before us today. It doesn't carry out the necessary investigations into the community needs to be served. The former Commissioner went on to say, "The Directorate's planning section is chronically understaffed and can only process development applications, which," he says, "it manages poorly." Again, "It's unable to draw up master plans for the revival of Woden Town Centre, nor for Civic, nor for Belconnen," he was going to say last night. Further, the former Commissioner went on to say that the article says last night at the meeting he was going to, and I'll quote from the article, "point to the machinations of the LDA, the use of commercial in-confidence arrangements to hide information, and the alleged gaming of land release programs to maximise profits as examples of it not following due process." There's much more I could read, Madam Speaker, but I think it illustrates some of the points that I was trying to make today. And what it does is point to many of the comments that I've received from community members who've said, for example, the direction the panel was being taken by EPSD has degenerated to a point where the whole process is a farce that is blatantly supporting the FGC proposal. It's from a member of the community, Madam Speaker. The proponents' assertion that they couldn't afford any delays at the panel meant that the department was trying to push this through as quickly as possible in some community members and groups' views. For example, a quote provided to me, I was not there at the meeting, but I'm told that the Deputy Director General said, "This one will go on for 4 or 5 meetings if we're working well." So community members were surprised that their meetings were truncated at 3. They thought they were working well, and they were still awaiting responses from the department and the government on data and information that they'd requested that they had not yet received. They had every expectation that the panel will continue, not be stopped in what they believe was a way, in their view, of pushing forward the proposal without due consideration of the community's views. It's not to say that if the process had continued and they'd been provided with the answers, they may well have supported a lot of the proposal in the end. But they feel like they were led down the garden path and left there at the bottom of the garden with no way back. They weren't given the information to find their way back. They weren't given the information of where they were going in the first place, and they were just left there, left hanging, which was not what they expected of this process of community consultation and community panel. You know, people have said to me that they feel this process pointed towards a fait accompli, that the proposal would be approved, and they felt they were being used to try to achieve that goal. When that wasn't going necessarily to happen, the process was truncated. Thanks so much, see you later, off you go, if you can get out the locked door, of course. So, Madam Speaker, we will not be supporting Mr Gentleman's amendment. I don't believe that there's trust in the community to let the general process go forward. They've lost the trust of community members. We will not be supporting Mr Gentleman's amendment.
The question is, Mr Gentleman's amendment be agreed to? Ms Lauder, are you speaking? Sorry, Ms Lakuta?
I was going to speak to move my amendment.
So there's a question before it. Is that Mr Gentleman's motion amendment be agreed to? Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it. So the question is, Ms Lauder's original motion be agreed to. Ms Lakuta?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to move the amendment circulated in my name.
So the question is then that Ms Lakuta's amendment be agreed to. Ms Lakuta?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In moving this, you will note that I'm only moving to replace the second paragraph, the calls. I'll talk about those in particular. But what I'm saying is that I'm in substantive agreement with Ms Lauder that there is a significant problem in the environs of Red Hill, and that what we are trying to do is something that is going to work for the community. It's something that's going to ensure that our natural environment is protected. It's something that's going to ensure that the traffic and amenity issues are properly considered, and something importantly that is going to be a holistic look at developments in that area and ensure that the cumulative impact of the many potential developments are considered instead of the current process, which seems to be one by one by one. I point out that we basically appear to be talking at the least about 2 developments at this point of time. There's been some discussion of the federal golf course, whose current plan, I believe it's their 8th try. I used to live in Garran last century and was well aware that's how long it's been going on for. The current intention is 125 homes with a new golf club, swimming pool and gym in the middle of the golf club, and that includes plans to upgrade the Gowrie Drive access roads, and that is one of the most problematical parts of the whole plan. But also down on the Telstra site, old Telstra site, which is on Kent Street and the border between Deakin and Hughes. This is a proposal for 550 residential units. Both of these plans abut the Red Hill Nature Reserve. Both of these plans have been touted before. They both require territory plan variations. They both have so far not achieved the level of community support which would mean, I guess, that the government thought that was and the proponents thought there was any point in going a lot further. There's also, of course, a large number of urban open space blocks of land in Garran and Hughes and Deakin, all of which abut the Red Hill Nature Reserve. And I'm very aware that residents, and I should point out that we are joined by 4 local residents for this debate. Thank you very much. Residents are concerned that this space is, if everything's being done on a piecemeal basis, then all of this space is potentially, who knows what plans there are for this space. Ms Lauder's made a number of comments about the community panel process, and she's quoted from similar emails to what I've had. It was really weird. Ms Lauder and me were both invited in our roles as members of the planning committee to attend this, and it seemed quite bizarre because we were to attend at the end and hear a summary, and we weren't given a chance to talk or to hear what other people said, just a summary. I could only see that our role was to stand up and say, yes, the community has been in the same room as the developers and thus has qualified as consultation. I think that probably a photograph would have done as much good as the role that we were asked to be part of. It was actually got even worse than that. Well, we were meant to be invited to all of the panels. I'm not aware that I got any invitation to the second. The third I was only invited to after I was part of an email chain which included people discussing their invitation and included ACPLA, and ACPLA, I guess, belatedly realised, oh, we haven't bothered inviting the MLAs. It was also something the community was told to keep in confidence, in good faith. which made it impossible, of course, for community representatives to adequately represent the community they are part of if they couldn't discuss what they were talking about. All in all, while I do obviously support efforts of ACTPLA to better involve the community, I'm not trying to be negative about the process. I'm just saying that it wasn't adequate to do what it's trying to do. It was so bad that the six community group members of the panel, the Conservation Council, Deakin Residents Association, Friends of Grasslands, Garran and Hughes Residents Action Group, Hughes Residents Association and the Red Hill Regenerators, they were so concerned they wrote a document which included their views, which I understand was sent to the ACT government and all Murrumbidgee and Kurrajong MLAs. Their document, a lot of what I've said, of course, is informed by that document, and it said the Red Hill area is now faced with two very large residential developments which will have a wide range of environmental and social impacts on the open space area. There is every prospect that further damaging developments and activities will be proposed in the future. This is a recipe for disaster in this sensitive and significant landscape. If these proposals are dealt with on a case-by-case basis, it will be planning by development rather than development by planning. For this situation to be avoided, an overarching planning and management framework needs to be developed and implemented. My amendment is an attempt to make that management framework be developed and implemented, given the lack of support from ACTPLA to make this happen. Yeah. And given the fact that over the more than 20, probably 30 years of this little saga, it has not happened. I point out that the Red Hill Nature Reserve is very important environmentally. It contains nationally significant remnant endangered yellow box and red gum grassy woodland. This comprises over 200 native plant species, a number of which are threatened and rare, as are a number of animal species which are supported by the woodland. It's also of national significance. It's being included in a nomination for inclusion in the National Heritage List, and it's a critical part of the multifunction urban open space system. It has visual, cultural and ecological significance. It's being impacted adversely by a number of things. Dumping of gravel, building spoil, dumping of trees, other vegetation, installation and maintenance of telecommunications infrastructure, in creation and widening of fire trails, gas pipeline construction, planting of exotic and non-Indigenous native species, maintenance of power lines and cables, removal of vegetation for flood prevention and fire suppression, and water supply infrastructure. There has been significant numbers of piecemeal activities over this area, and they have resulted in significant damage done to this area. This damage should stop. And the proposed location of the Federal Golf Club and the Telstra site, has the additional issue of, we understand there are two adjacent legacy rubbish chips which contain toxic waste. Remember, it's next to the Telstra site. Telstra obviously as a telecommunications area organisation would have had PCBs as part of their waste, and of course there's every reason to believe there is asbestos in these wastes. It just seems crazy to consider developing on that. Other thing, of course, is as well as Red Hill being a very valuable nature reserve, it's part of the local amenity for the people who live there, the people who live in the suburb of Red Hill, the people who live in Deakin, the people who live in Hughes, the people who live in Garran. It is a significant part of their local amenity. The roads that will be affected by any development there are roads that they go through on a daily basis. Kent Street is already dangerous and overcrowded. It will lead to more congestion on that road and on nearby suburbs. As has been noted, the golf club is on a bushfire-prone area, and it has some of this land has been accessed as a high bushfire risk. And providing safe access to this site will make a major impact on Red Hill. I assume the discussions have all been that the access would be through the nature reserve, not through urban areas. Interestingly, it's also been reported, the Canberra Times reported, that the Golf Club has asked the government to waive or discount the lease variation charge that the proposal would otherwise attract. The Canberra Times reported that the proposal would bring in an $18 million windfall for the club, and that this leads to considerable issues as to who should get the benefit of any lease variation and how this should be shared with the community as a whole rather than a few hundred people who may be members of the Federal Golf Club. The other thing that is important in terms of looking at the golf club is that it's unlikely to be the last development on the golf club. In my first term in the Assembly, I had the privilege, possibly, of being part, as did Mr Coe, of considering a second territory plan variation for the golf club in Holt. They'd already put residential in the middle of their golf course. That got them some money and out of trouble for a period of time. Wasn't enough to solve all the problems, and they're back for a second go. There is no reason to think that this would not happen at the Federal Golf Club if there isn't finally some integrated planning done for the Federal Golf Club. And actually, I would contend for all the golf clubs in Canberra, this is an ongoing problem. The issue is long-term holistic planning. And this, despite what Mr Gentleman said in his speech, does not seem to be what ACTPLA is currently doing. On the 20th of September, I asked Minister Gentle about the two proposals. I said, Minister, what will you do to ensure the joint impacts are considered, not just separate impacts? Mr Gentleman said, the important thing here is that our Planning Directorate works with engineers within the traffic section to ensure that traffic engineers have input into the planning system to make sure the impacts on our roads across the ACT and the impact on traffic in the ACT is regulated along with any approvals in planning. He didn't say that cumulative impacts would be considered. I mean, this is shit. You would have thought the job of a competent planning authority to look holistically at these issues. What ACTPLA is doing is simply not good enough. So I'll move on to my calls. The first call, not to proceed with separate territory plan variations for residential developments for Section 66 Kent Street, the Federal Golf Course and other sites immediately adjacent to Red Hill Nature Reserve. Now, importantly, please note, I'm talking only about territory plan variations. Any development that only requires a development application, in other words, anything that's already consistent with the territory plan, such as normal extensions, knockdown rebuilds, would not be affected by this. Then I'm saying that we should only proceed with a joint territory plan variation for these sites after the completion of an integrated plan for Red Hill Nature Reserve and surrounding residential areas. That firstly includes a detailed environmental plan to protect Red Hill Nature Reserve from the impact of proposed developments. I mean, that is clearly essential. It's a nature reserve. If there's any point in having nature reserves, we have to look at the impact of the developments on them. Secondly, addresses the joint transport and amenity impacts of the proposed development. The important point in this is the word joint. There is no point in having one by one looking at developments and everyone saying, oh, it's only going to add an extra couple of cars. It doesn't make any difference. After you have enough extra couple of cars, it does make a difference. Thirdly, includes a detailed investigation of the old Deacon Tip site and rules out development on any areas that may be contaminated and unsafe. That, I think, is just clearly common sense. We don't develop on top of contaminated sites. Lastly, 4, limits developments to proposals that have been developed in close consultation with the community and have a reasonable likelihood of majority community support. This is one of the keys, I think, to development in Canberra and everywhere else. There is no point in proposing developments where the community is actively opposed to it. There's also no point in just doing lots of little things. If we go with the process that I'm talking about, I'm asking ACTPLA to look at the whole area, to look at an integrated plan. Let the community say, yes, clearly things have been talked about here for years. There will be some changes. What, looking at the whole area, is the best way to do this going forwards? There needs to be open consultation, which includes the impact on the nature reserve, includes the local amenity, and also, of course, includes the impacts and needs of a growing Canberra. The bottom line is that we need to do a holistic approach that if we do this well and ACTPLA works as a professional planning authority and does this well, there will be community approval because the community will be consulted and told... Sorry, I ran out of... Yes.
Thank you. Your time has expired, Ms Lakota. So the question is that your amendment be agreed to. Mr Coe.
Madam Speaker, I wish to particularly address some of the integrity issues that obviously surround this action by the government. Of course, it's no secret that there's been talk about development on this site for decades. And for decades, or at least the last 16 years, the AST Labor government has been somewhat reluctant to do much about it. Yet, in the last few months, Madam Speaker, everything seems to have changed. The environment is still there, the neighbouring houses are still there, the golf course is still there. Madam Speaker, there's only one variable at play here, and that is the allegiance of club groups that now the Federal Golf Club belongs to. And importantly, the follow-up action from the Minister. At best, Madam Speaker, this is controversial. At worst, it's corruption. And I would dearly love to know what assurances the Labor government, and in particular Minister Gentleman, gave to the Federal Golf Club in the event that they were to change their allegiance. Because that's what it comes down to, in my opinion. Or that's what it certainly could appear to come down to. It would be fascinating to know whether Mr. Gentleman actually did say that if you change your allegiance away from the anti-government club group to the pro-government club group, we'll see what we can do. It'd be fascinating to know if Minister Gentleman has been involved in any such negotiations, because it seems that as soon as that happened, the government has rolled out the red carpet for this lease variation and possible territory plan variation. The red carpet has been rolled out in a way that we haven't seen before. And we actually asked Minister Gentleman questions about this, about other times where there has been a process similar to this put up for another development in Canberra. And he was unable to say a single example where ACTPLA had pulled out all stops to try and get this development up. Because the government is now tirelessly advocating for this development to get up, despite the fact that for 16 years they've been critical of this very proposal. What has changed, Madam Speaker? What has changed to make the government change their tune? And of course, it is the change of allegiances or change of membership from the Federal Golf Club to another club group. Now, in many ways, I don't actually begrudge the Federal Golf Club for making that move, especially if they are actually given an assurance from the Minister that they would help them along the journey if they were to do that switch. It's quite a transactional approach. If they change their club allegiance, the government will look favourably on their proposed development application. A perhaps they are doing what's best for their members by making that switch, given the potential promise or potential commitment that the Minister Gentleman might have given. It goes to the integrity of the government, Madam Speaker, that this is how you get decisions made in Canberra. This is how you get a job done. It's by, in effect, joining Labor's fellow travellers. Things aren't done on their merits. They're not done on the planning quality. They're not done on the environmental impact. They're done on whether you're a fellow traveller of the Labor movement. And last year we heard a lot about sovereign risk and the government trying to concoct some argument about light rail. Well, the sovereign risk in the ACT is linked to the dodgy deals that this government does in its pet projects for fellow travellers. And we see it time and time again. And it's a shame that the Federal Golf Club has been embroiled in this integrity issue because, quite frankly, I don't think they necessarily went in with their eyes wide open in terms of what they potentially were getting themselves into, in terms of the mess that is Labor property deals. They may well have gone in with their eyes wide open in terms of a transactional approach, in terms of trying to get a good outcome, but I very much doubt that they realised the links that could so easily be drawn to the many other scandals that have plagued this government in recent years with regard to property deals. We, of course, know about the issues with the casino and the Glebe Park block. We know about the issues of the lakeside businesses and land. We know about the issues with the rural leases and the Dixon CFMEU land swap. We know about the issues with the Woden tradies and their car park rort. We know about all these, and unfortunately, this Federal Golf Club deal could very well join that list. It shouldn't be, Madam Assistant Speaker, that the way to get development applications up, the way to get territory plan variations made, is to join the Labor cause. But unfortunately, that's what it seems to have come to in the ACT. That is corruption. That's what it's come to in the ACT.
Mr. Gentleman.
Mr. Cove has used the word corruption against me and the government a number of times during his speech, and I ask that he recall that statement.
Mr. Wall.
Mr. Coe's been very, very careful not to name any one individual or member of this place in those corruption allegations, but more specifically the government as a whole.
Excuse me just for one moment. On the point of order, I feel that Mr. Wall hasn't necessarily named any one person in particular. However, can I... Mr. Coe, sorry about that. Mr. Wall, you spoke last, sorry. Mr. Coe hasn't specifically named an individual. However, can I remind members in this place that we do have parliamentary standing orders that we must adhere to, and if there are substantive matters that would like to be raised, then maybe it needs to be a separate motion, or if there is actual information that needs to be taken to authorities, then that also needs to be considered. Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We will certainly take on board that advice as to whether a substantive motion is required on this matter. I have been very careful to point out that I believe the government is corrupt, and whilst Minister Gentleman did stand up and say that I had accused him of corruption, I did no such thing. But I do have real concerns about the government at large. And I think it's all too common a story in the ACT and Labor governments around the country that have been in for too long, that the complacency kicks in, the nepotism and cronyism is at full speed, and the corruption follows. And unfortunately, that is quite possibly what has happened here with regard to this proposed development in or adjacent to Red Hill. So, Madam Assistant Speaker, I too call on the Assembly to not proceed with the government's course of action. I think their course of action is wrong. It is not best practice and is by no means something that we should establish as a precedent in the ACT.
The question is that Ms Lakuta's amendment be agreed to. Mr Gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. I want to put on the record, firstly, in response to Mr Coe's allegations and spurious allegations, that I've had no conversations with the Royal Canberra Golf Club in regard to any associations they have with any groups at all, Madam Assistant Speaker. It is spurious to invent such an allegation as Mr Coe has, and Mr Coe slurs both the community clubs and community groups with that allegation, and I would suggest that he should be ashamed of himself and he should publicly withdraw that allegation to those community groups and clubs, Madam Assistant Speaker. In regard to the amendment itself, I think I said pretty clearly in my speech on my amendment what we need to achieve in a planning sense, that planning should be separate to the Assembly process, is an independent planning authority, and any intervention with that by the Assembly does implicate the independence of that planning authority for the future.
The question is that Ms Lakuta's amendment be agreed to. Ms Lauder.
Thank you. To speak to the amendment and to close. Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. I have a table that came through in a Freedom of Information request about this area, and it goes back. A table says, I found this briefing from 2013 and updated it. That was in 2015. If you go back many years, 1999, variation 1994 are disallowed in the Assembly because of leasing issues, inconsistency with the principles of the Territory Plan, and impacts on formal and informal open space area. 2007, Government supported the process for a draft variation on the basis that the golf club had experienced financial difficulties relating to the maintenance of the golf club due to prolonged drought and the cost of water. The proposal did not differ greatly from previous proposals in the disallowed variation 94. It goes on, various events over the years, and to 2011, Minister Barr wrote to the NCA advising about diplomatic uses. While that would be lower density than the residential redevelopment proposed by the Federal Golf Club, but the issues still remain to be resolved. Access to the site is via an adjoining nature reserve, bushfire issues, and the need for 2 points of emergency services access. There's quite detailed information of the applications over the years for residential development in the area. The issues, though, remain the same. The issues remain the same. We've seen this application or the proposal that has been talked about through the community panel. As Mr Coe has said, there's some sympathy for the Federal Golf Club. It's not to say that their development is a bad proposal. No one here is saying that. What we're concerned about is a holistic approach that looks at the environmental impacts and ensures that we maintain the environmental values and make sure that if this particular proposal gets approved, that the next one is also able to ensure that we retain those environmental aspects, the amenity, the vehicular access and the public transport concerns. It's not about one proposal. It's about looking at the area as a whole. And I'll go back to the article from the Riot Act yesterday from the former NCDC Commissioner and read a bit more of it just because I can, and I think it's so illustrative of the issues that are besetting the planning environment at the moment. Mr Powell says in this article, what is needed is a planning organisation with a core of professional staff so as to be in a state of constant engagement with the local community, business and trade interests. It's not just the community that have, the ultimate say. There are other interests at stake, but everyone must be consulted. Everyone must have their views considered and a very delicate path navigated to ensure that we have all of these considerations. Mr Powell, in this article, believes the Directorate has, in recent times, adopted an inappropriate attitude of blindly adopting zoning changes determined by the LDA, which is likely to carry over to both the new Suburban Land Agency and the City Renewal Authority. With respect to residents and community groups disagreeing with the government, residents and community groups are entitled to disagree with and to oppose the actions of government. It's called democracy. And it was Mr Stanhope, former Chief Minister of the ACT, who made that point in an article referring to the Chief Minister's refusal to deal with the club's industry body, Clubs ACT, where Mr Barr, in this article, Mr Stanhope says Mr Barr has shut the group out after it bankrolled a campaign against Labor at the last election, saying, this is a quote from Mr Stanhope, Mr Barr's Trump-like response to Clubs ACT daring to oppose the government over the decision to give a casino poker machines does seem, at best, a tad petulant. The fact that the Federal Golf Club have had to leave Clubs ACT to get extra support from the government, in their view, reeks of a lack of integrity. This is more than about just planning at Red Hill. This is about government integrity at all levels of planning in the ACT. We've heard this government refusing to meet with anyone that disagrees with them. The Master Builders Association, where no one from the government went to their annual dinner, which was shining a spotlight on mental health for tradesmen. We've heard about them refusing to meet with Clubs ACT and also the greyhound industry. Residents and community organisations are entitled to disagree with and to oppose the actions of government. It's called democracy, said Mr Stanhope, something that appears sadly lacking in this government. You either agree with them or you're on the outer. You're in the tent or you've got no hope whatsoever. That's what's happening with this government, which brings us back to the motion and the amendment that we've been talking about today. And the Minister, the Planning Minister, is so disinterested in this process, he's left the chamber. He's not even here to see the end of the discussion on the planning, on a planning matter. Not that interested. So I find myself in an interesting and somewhat uncomfortable position, a position I'm not often in, and that's of agreeing with the Greens. I'm sure Ms Lakuta would agree with me that this is not something that happens very often. And the reason that I'm agreeing with the Greens today is that there has been a lack of transparency and openness in the discussion with community groups. There has been a process which they believe has driven towards a particular outcome, which they feel has been a sham consultation, which they believe has had dodgy elements to it in terms of the consultation, and it's all pointing towards a predetermined outcome. That's the reason we have this motion today, that community groups don't believe that it was genuine consultation. They don't believe that their views are being taken into account, and they believe that what's going to happen is what was always going to happen. And we will see that in due course, Madam Assistant Speaker, what happens with this particular proposal and with other proposals in the area. You know, residents who've been there for some time understand the importance of that area. I'm sure the people who are here in the chamber today have all undertaken recreational activities in the Red Hill open space area. You know, it's a fantastic area, and not only recreational, but the key environmental values. You know, we've I think on both sides of the chamber, all sides of the chamber, you know, we talk a lot about urban renewal and the need for density, you know, the importance of greater density in some of our suburbs. And the government certainly is against development. We're not against development either. But there has to be a balance. And the community groups don't believe that their views have been adequately taken into account. That's why I brought this motion today. That's why we will be supporting Ms Lakuta's amendment. And it's because we believe in consultation with the community. We believe that the community's views are important and that we shouldn't be undertaking these sham consultations with groups trying to shut out a democratic process, with a government that's trying to shut out particular groups. That is not the way that we should be undertaking the government and the governance of the ACT. Thank you.
The question is that Ms Lakuta's amendment to Ms Lauder's motion be agreed to. All of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that the motion as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Clerk.
Members' business, notice number 2.
With the motion on the notice paper listed in my name regarding general rates in the ACT for units.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Mr Coe.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. My motion today calls on the government to reverse the unfair changes to the methodology for calculating general rates paid by units. This revenue-raising tactic has had an overwhelmingly negative impact on unit owners and has placed many in financial distress. Instead of alleviating cost of living pressures, this Labor Greens government seems determined to raise the cost of living to new heights. The government has been heavy-handed in its management of rates and land taxes. Many properties have been hit with rates and land tax increases in excess of 50%. It is irresponsible for the government to promote this as a positive policy outcome, to somehow say it's fair to slug people more. The justification for these changes don't stack up, and the Labor government won't own up and fix the problem that they have created. Madam Assistant Speaker, it has been put forward by both Labor and the Greens that the reason for these changes is that the owners are not paying a fully proportional share of ratings revenue. What we have not been told is the equivalent figures for other dwelling types. What are the equivalent figures for small houses, or for 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom houses, or for large houses? A significant proportion of rates is already raised through a fixed charge with levies. This can total $1,089. If a fully proportional share of rate revenue is a policy aim of this government, why not do away with the valuation-based charge and only have a fixed charge per residence? That would be the way if you actually want to have a standard fee across Canberra. Now, we, of course, are not advocating for that, but it seems that the government is being somewhat inconsistent with their argument. Madam Speaker, the Treasurer has attempted to deflect criticism by claiming that more than 46,000 units in the ACT will remain in the lowest marginal rating category, that is below $150,000. This has been refuted by a number of industry advocates. Only a handful of small dual occupancies and apartments would be exclusively in that category. Once the AUV for each entire strata property exceeds that $150,000 threshold, all units share in paying higher AUV marginal rates. Madam Speaker, this year we're seeing massive increases on the back of the government's changes. For some, we're seeing the valuation-based charge increase to 0.6, up from 0.296. This is seeing the ratings for particular properties through, this is sending the ratings for a particular property through the roof. The higher rate now applies to all of the 280 units in one particular complex, meaning that the government has gained tens of thousands of dollars more revenue in this year alone from one particular building. The changes also appear to be in contravention of recommendations the government agreed to in the ACT taxation review, which was chaired by former Labor Treasurer Mr Ted Quinlan. Recommendation 4 of the review was that, to the extent possible, the government would ensure that there are no disincentives for households and businesses to locate within territory borders as opposed to the surrounding region. If we look to the surrounding New South Wales councils, they are increasing their rates by 1.5% in 2017-18. Meanwhile, the ACT government's changes will see increases perhaps as much as 30% for some units. This is over and above the foreshadowed average ratings increase of almost 15% between now and 2019. Of course, we have compounding rates since 2012. The rises will continue to compound year after year as they have already done. It is no wonder, Madam Assistant Speaker, that so many people are choosing to live across the border. When you put this on top of the cheaper land that exists outside of the ACT, unfortunately, it makes the ACT quite unattractive compared to these other jurisdictions when it comes to the cost of living. Madam Speaker, as I have already outlined, every resident in the ACT pays the same fixed charge, from modest homes through to the largest. What determines the difference in rates is the valuation-based charge, which is, of course, the sliding scale applied to the AUV. It is this scale that the government has now rigged in its favour and against residents. These changes run counter to recommendations the government endorsed in the ACT taxation review. These changes undermine the ACT's planning strategies, foremost of which is to create a more compact, efficient city by focusing on urban intensification in town centres, around group centres and along major public transport routes. Madam Assistant Speaker, when you look at government services provided to unit owners, I think there probably is a case for lower rates, not higher rates. It is unfair, I believe, that units occupy a fraction of land of single dwellings, yet this government seems to treat them all as if they are exactly the same. The general rates of unit owners in one suburb have increased by $730 this year alone, which is on top of a surge in land tax of $1,375. So, if you were renting out a property in this suburb, you would have an increase of $2,100 that will simply have to be passed on to renters. That's why, in effect, the increases we're seeing to rates and the increases to land tax are, in effect, rent taxes. In this particular suburb, where there's been an increase of $2,100 for unit owners, we're, in effect, going to see an increase of around $40 per week in rent, simply to recover that additional money. The one-off rebate of $100 has done little to soften the blow for Canberrans when they pay when they actually pay or receive and then pay their rates notices. I've been contacted by constituents who feel insulted that $100 is supposed to offset the doubling of their rates and land taxes that they have received in recent years. In recent years, the government has channelled people into units. The government has entered into arrangements with developers, allowing them to build more units in return for selling part of their stock as affordable housing. Many vulnerable Canberrans who have taken advantage of those schemes are now being put under further financial pressures due to the rates and land tax increases that we're experiencing in the ACT. Many people have been struggling for years, and now they're struggling even more. The opposition, of course, has to ask the question, what will be the impact of these changes on the rental market, both in terms of supply, but also in terms of the amount that people are actually paying? The changes are obviously going to make owning a unit in Canberra substantially less attractive. The only feasible option for landlords is to pass on the significant increases to their tenants, who will in turn suffer financially. It's still more bad luck for any investor who has had any trouble finding a tenant, because they'll be slugged with paying land tax whether the property is occupied or not. On top of all this, the discount for early payments of rates has dropped to 1%, at the same time that unit owners are facing double-digit increases to their rates and land tax bills. Unfortunately, this is something that the ACT Labor Greens government calls fair. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that the government has not provided any real justification for the changes to the methodology for calculating general rates paid by units. Units do not require the same level of services as single dwellings. And this is a point the government has made repeatedly when trying to encourage people to move into units. So therefore, it simply doesn't make sense that the significant increases in rates, of course, do not correlate with any additional benefits provided to unit owners by the government. In short, the new calculation methodology is unfair and is causing vulnerable Canberrans real financial hardship. It is quite possibly going to see rents go up even more and perhaps the supply of properties go down. We're going to see a real impact as a result of this government's policy, and this Assembly today has an opportunity to send a message to the government that we, as representatives of our community, simply do not support the government's approach to increasing rates across the board, but particularly with regard to units and apartments.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Mr Barr.
Thank you. Madam Assistant Speaker, I move the amendment circulated in my name.
Mr Barr.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. I've moved the amendment today to outline why the government is undertaking the changes to the rates calculation for the methodology of units. I do so in the context of this debate being had in this place on 3 or 4 occasions already, noting that it was announced in the 2016 budget before the last territory election that we would be updating the way rates were calculated for unit titled properties. And the rationale for that is to achieve better equity between the contribution made by owners of units and those with freestanding homes. We then, of course, brought forward legislation to give effect to this change, which was considered by the Assembly this year. So that this matter is even on the notice paper and has been allowed to come forward for debate might reflect we are considering the same matter again inside a 12-month period. As members in this place would no doubt be aware, general rates not only cover municipal services in the Territory, such as roads and rubbish collection, but because of our unique single level of government, rates also contribute to our state-level responsibilities, including education, health, public transport and the range of other state government services that the ACT government provides to Canberrans. In this context, it is important then that everyone in the community contributes fairly. Changes to the rates calculation methodology for units have better aligned what property owners pay with rates on freestanding homes with equivalent market values. So previously, Madam Assistant Speaker, unit holders generally paid significantly less. For example, as my amendments to Mr Coe's motion note, under the old method, someone with a $500,000 unit in the city paid $400 a year less in rates than someone with a free-standing home in outer suburban Canberra, for example, in a suburb like Charnwood. The government doesn't consider that that is fair or equitable, which is why we brought forward the changes. Now, there are many great advantages to owning an apartment in the inner city, but paying far cheaper rates than a family in a freestanding home worth the same amount in Tuggeranong or Belconnen should not be one of them. The general rates and land tax calculations for multi-unit dwellings are now based on the total average unimproved value of the land rather than the AUV of the individual unit. Now, for some property owners, this change in methodology has resulted in a change in their rates liability, and that's why the government has provided a rebate to assist with the transition. But it is important to note, Madam Assistant Speaker, that even after the methodology change, over 90% of unit holders pay rates as if they were in the lowest two marginal rating categories. And by way of comparison, the average rates on units across the city is $1,352, compared with $2,295 on average for freestanding homes. So that's a difference of more than $900 a year. Now, we understand and acknowledge that as a result of tax reform, some Canberrans are paying more than they were previously. Other Canberrans are reaping thousands and thousands of dollars in stamp duty savings, Madam Assistant Speaker, and that is reflected in the mobility within our city. Now, it may have escaped the attention of Mr Coe and indeed of other members in this place, but 67,000 Canberrans live in a different address, lived in a different address in 2016 than they did in 2015. 18.6% of the population moved in the last year. Half of Canberra live in a different address than they did 5 years ago. Live in a different address than they did 5 years ago. There is a high amount of mobility.
Members.
There is a high amount of mobility in this city, and people do move house, and they do, Madam Speaker, Madam Assistant Speaker, benefit from significant stamp duty reductions. And if this, Madam Assistant Speaker, isn't enough evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of tax reform in improving mobility, and yes, of course, renting is a component, but is Mr Coe seriously arguing that no one has moved house to buy a house in the ACT in the last 5 years? He is kidding himself. And in the end, ultimately, Madam Assistant Speaker, if our policy was so unpopular, the government would not have been re-elected in the last two elections on this tax reform policy. So if it's that unpopular, if so many people are upset by it, the government would not be sitting on this side of the chamber. The Labor Party would not still be in government. And if Mr Coe wants to run a third election campaign opposing tax reform, good luck to him. It's been so successful for the Liberal Party in the last two elections. If he wants to rerun 2012 and 2016 again, bring it on. This tax reform is important. If Mr Coe's dire warnings of no one moving to Canberra were true, why is this the fastest growing state or territory in this nation? Why is our population growing so strongly if this government's policies are so unattractive to so many people? In Mr Coe's worldview, no one would be living in Canberra, and this is where the facts and the evidence are so clear, Madam Assistant Speaker. And those opposite can continue this campaign of negativity. I welcome it. Great. Keep on opposing this reform. It's worked so successfully for you in 2012 and 2016. And if we need a further,
Mrs. Jones.
if we need a further example of just how out of touch this opposition party is to sensible tax reform, we need look only at the work of the Productivity Commission, the report commissioned by their own federal colleague Scott Morrison, that once again recommended that state and territory governments should phase out stamp duties and replace them with broad-based land taxes. Exactly what this government is doing, Madam Assistant Speaker. Once again, we have demonstrated that we are implementing good public policy. We are cutting stamp duty. And for someone purchasing a $500,000 property in the ACT, they are now saving $7,700 on what they would have paid under Mr Coe's preferred tax model. And again, if he wants to go to the next election arguing that he will put stamp duty back up, that he will jack it back up on every single property in this city, good. Let him go forward with that policy. I know Mr Hanson didn't in 2016. He shied away from jacking stamp duty up, so having opposed tax reform for the first 5 years, when given the opportunity to say, no, I will reverse it, he didn't. Mr Coe similarly will squib that issue when it comes to the 2020 election. He will not go to the 2020 election promising to reintroduce an insurance tax, promising to make payroll tax higher, and he will not, Madam Assistant Speaker, I will confidently predict, suggest that stamp duty should be increased. So once again we have a university debating motion from Mr Coe revisiting an issue that this Assembly dealt with in legislation earlier this year. So I commend my amendment to the Assembly. I wish to assure all Assembly members that the government's commitment to tax reform continues, because it's the right thing to do for this community. It provides secure and stable revenues to provide the health, education, municipal and community services that this growing community needs, to invest in the infrastructure that the fastest growing state or territory needs. And I am very happy, Madam Assistant Speaker, for that policy contrast to continue. We won the 2012 and 2016 elections on this policy, and we will continue this reform agenda. Mr Coe could oppose it, and again I say bring it on. Go to 2020, like you did in 2016 and 2012 so unsuccessfully, arguing to undo this reform or reverse it. There's the challenge for you. If you think stamp duties are the way forward, if you think that reinstituting a tax on insurance is the best public policy approach, go for it.
So we take it to the election 2022.
But we, Madam Assistant Speaker, we took our tax policy to the 2012 and 2016 elections and were re-elected twice. We will continue that approach. Mr Coe can continue to oppose our tax reforms. Mr Coe can continue to oppose our tax reforms. His colleagues can continue their path of economic lunacy. They can continue to oppose sensible public policy as recommended by their own federal treasurer through his Productivity Commission report. If they want to do that, bring it on.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Ms Lakuta.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. This motion is very similar to the motion from Mr Cohen on rates that we debated in September, and as in September we will not be supporting it. We will instead be supporting Mr Barr's amendment. As I said back in September, the ACT Greens support the government raising revenue because there are lots of things that the community wants the government to do. The community wants a public health system, they want a public transport system, they want a public education system, they want parks, they want playgrounds, they want footpaths, they want roads. These things need to be paid for, and this means that some taxation is required. It's very easy for Mr Coe to be against rate rises, But in practice, that means he is supporting something else. Possibly he's supporting stamp duty. Possibly he's supporting cuts to the health system, the education system, the playgrounds, public health. I mean, I don't know. And Mr Coe has not specified. The Greens are not going to support cuts to services that the community value very highly. This means that we do support adequate government revenue. The key points that we need to think about in terms of this is how to raise revenue with equity and efficiency. The ACT Greens support the ACT Government's taxation reform program on efficiency grounds. We are not alone on this. As Mr Barr pointed out, the Productivity Commission has recently, in the last day or two, stated that it thinks that all states and territories should follow the ACT's lead and move away from stamp duty towards more rates system. And it is supported, of course, by most economists and business groups. So I'm not going to talk at length because I think we're in furious agreement. What I'm going to talk about more is the other part of the issue, being ensuring that our taxation system is equitable and fair. While the taxation reform system has been and is widely supported as an economic efficiency reform, social justice and fairness are just as important. As I said in September, the Greens are focused on ensuring that the reforms don't have unintended consequences for vulnerable people in our community, and this is where we think that more work is needed. I'll speak about equity and fairness in three parts. First, I'll talk about units because clearly that was the focus of Mr Coe's motion. Secondly, I want to raise a possible solution that could reduce some of the difficulties in our whole rate system. And thirdly, I want to talk about some issues for fairness for the whole rate system. Looking specifically at the rating system for units, the reason it's being changed, as Mr Barr stated, is to improve the equity of the rating system. I would like to direct the attention of members to the Charnwood example in Mr Barr's amendment. A pensioner in a $500,000 house in Charnwood should not be paying $400 a year more in rates than a pensioner in a $500,000 unit in the city. It's reasonable to assume that they're both in a similar financial situation. The pensioner in the unit will have body corporate fees but will have less maintenance costs. For example, when they get to an age that mowing is too hard, the pensioner in Charnwood may need to pay for someone to get it done. And the same goes, of course, whether we're talking about pensioners or non-pensioners, homeowners. We've heard an argument that people in units use less services than people in houses. That might be true, but it's only to a very tiny extent. Over the past few years, I've actually moved from a house in Downer to a multi-storey unit, and now I'm in a townhouse in Woden. And I'm not aware that I've actually used anything much in the way of less government services. So I do support the change in the rating system to improve fairness between units and houses. The second point I'd like to make is also illustrated by the Charnwood example in Mr Barr's amendment. That is, are we using the fairest, most equitable rating system? In the ACT, we charge rates on the basis of unimproved capital value of the land. This means that the worst and the best house in the street pay the same rates and, if relevant, land tax. In many cases, that is clearly unfair. Why should someone, possibly an aged pensioner, with a small house that they've not been able to maintain, pay the same rates as someone with a house on the same street, but a house that is very likely 3 times as big and in much better condition? Arguably, it would be much fairer to charge rates on the basis of improved capital value. Looking at the ALP amendment example, this would mean that both ratepayers paid the same because the capital value of their house, their home, was the same, and so we wouldn't have any need to have a separate system for units and houses. In Victoria, councils can charge rates on the basis of improved capital value, and many of them do so. In the past, it would have been very challenging to do this, as of course it is harder to estimate the improved capital value than the unimproved capital value. However, over recent years, the advent of satellite imagery and online house valuation services means that it would appear to me that it should be a lot easier to work out the improved capital values that could be used as the basis of an improved rating system in the ACT. So I think that from an equity point of view, basing rates on improved capital values is something that the ACT government should consider. I'll now look at concessions and deferments. The idea of moving from stamp duty to rates was something that was first floated in the Henry Tax Review, and then from the ACT context it was looked at in the Quinlan Tax Review. And both of them, of course, did this basically on the basis of economic efficiency, and they paid very little attention to how the changes, which clearly would be beneficial for the average, would impact on disadvantaged families and individuals. The Quinlan Review stated that the ACT government must, and I quote, address the impacts on low-income households from the substitution of tax through the concession system with a possible expansion of the current rebate scheme, end quote. The government has a system of concessions and rebates to address some of the inequities in rates. The most common rebate granted by the ACT government is the pensioner rebate scheme for rates, with 18,007 recipients receiving a total of $10,856,220 in the 2016-17 year. This rebate scheme was recently changed, with a grandfathered uncapped scheme now being capped for new entrants to bring it closer to the most commonly used scheme. The change was done at the same time as expanding concessions on utilities so that low-income renters are better supported. And this, of course, is a change that the Greens support. But it had the impact, as the funds devoted to it were not expanded considerably, that some people are receiving a lower concession rebate. This year, many changes in rebates and concessions are happening at once, and also to the rating system with the changes to units. So some people this year are getting more assistance and some are getting less. And in the background, rates are going up faster for some categories of properties, notably units, than the others. So we are in a period of transition, and we need to be very careful that going forward we transit in a way that where we look carefully at the equity impacts of rates, concessions and rebates changes. If rates are rising more quickly in social security payments and lower quintile incomes, we probably need to make regular adjustments to rebate and deferment amounts and eligibility criteria to ensure that they remain equitable. Whilst the rate-based deferment scheme can provide assistance to some in this predicament, it is only available to people who own property in the 80th quintile of the average unimproved value, which means that the unimproved capital value of their property must be more than $416,000. My understanding is that this was originally introduced to help older people who didn't qualify for the standard pensioner deferment and had lived for many years in a suburb which had become expensive. As such, their rates had gone up much faster than people in other suburbs. I just actually can't see how this makes sense. If you live in an average or below average value house, you may well have more need to defer your rates than someone in a more expensive house, quite possibly because your income could be less for that person in a more expensive house. In particular, you're much less likely to be able to sell your house to downsize and still be able to stay in Canberra, because if you're already living in a cheaper house, then there are not likely to be that many cheaper options that you can downsize to. For these reasons, I would like to propose that the current age rates deferral scheme be widened to include all older homeowners who meet appropriate income criteria. These income criteria might need to be adjusted. As I've said in this chamber before, and I'm sure I'll be saying in this chamber again, the Greens support the taxation system being economically efficient as well as being fair and equitable. Economics and social justice are both important, and it's essential that we do both at once.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Mr Coe.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. In closing, we've heard an interesting argument from those opposite, which isn't too far off a poll tax, the way they're talking. But interestingly, Ms Lakuta is now in effect arguing against a compact city, arguing against density, and arguing for suburbia. Now, I, as is well known, don't have an issue with suburbia, but for years the Greens and the government's argument has been that single dwelling blocks are not sustainable. We need to have densification because apartment blocks have a lighter footprint on the environment than do private residences in RZ1 type areas. Now what we're hearing from Ms Lakuta is that in actual fact the footprint, the environmental footprint, the urban services footprint, and indeed the land footprint is the same if you live in an apartment as if you live in a single dwelling home. That's the argument. That's the argument that is being put forward by Mr Barr and Ms Lakuta. Now we, on this side, have got no problem with suburbia, but we also acknowledge that people in an apartment do take up less land than people in a single dwelling home. People in an apartment do require fewer services. They do require, in effect, less footpaths per block, or per person, per capita I should say. They do require less by way of road construction and various other forms of infrastructure. And that has always been the rationale for why having densification would actually limit sprawling cities. Yet today, what Ms Lakuta is arguing is that, in actual fact, regardless of whether you take up less land, regardless of whether you take up fewer services and require less infrastructure, you should in effect pay the same. It's certainly in contradiction to everything that we've heard from the Greens and the Labor Party in the past. Quite frankly, the Labor Party and the Greens are delusional if they think that the rates and land tax increases they have brought on is not having a huge detrimental impact for thousands of Canberra households. It is having a massive impact on those that simply can't afford it. And it's all very well for people who are affluent or people that have reserves to be able to say, I'm happy to pay a little bit more. But the truth is there are thousands of Canberra households that cannot pay more. They simply are not in a position to pay the extra $300 or $400 or $500 in rates this year alone. It is an extremely arrogant argument that is being put forward by Labor and the Greens that everyone is willing to pay more and everyone has the capacity to pay more. Because that is the argument. Because the government has capped concessions and they're driving up the costs of living in Canberra through rates, land tax and numerous other fees and charges. It is a very arrogant view that simply rejects the struggles of tens of thousands of Canberrans who are, in effect, working poor in our city. It is a travesty that those on the other side of the chamber, including the Greens, who claim to be champions of social justice, are willing to leave tens of thousands of Canberra households behind. It's all very well for Mr Barr to say, well, Canberra's growing. Well, quite frankly, Queanbeyan's growing at a faster rate than we are. And what does that say? What does it say? That the competitive city, a few kilometres away, is attracting more people relative to their size than Canberra is, yet somehow the Chief Minister has glossed over that fact. Queanbeyan, on the back of land prices and on the cost of living, particularly with regard to rates and land taxes, is considerably more attractive than the ACT. And that's a shame. We should be trying to make Canberra more attractive. If people want to be able to live in Canberra, they should be able to live in Canberra. But instead, this government is driving them away, driving them across the border, and they're doing it with the full support of the Greens. There are issues with the entire ratings regime in the ACT, but particularly with regard to the latest change for apartment and unit owners, it is simply unfair and it is absolutely in contradiction to the government's stated policy that they want densification. It is absolutely in contravention of that notion. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that the Greens and Labor that like to walk both sides of the street are in fact once again doubling down on this bad policy, because unfortunately it's tens of thousands of Canberrans that simply can't afford it but are being left to pay the price for this government.
Question is that Mr Barr's amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. It's my understanding Milligan and Pedersen are paired. Steele. Okay.
I said it to them. I was like, we've got all our back.
Okay, I'm just trying to stay awake. I literally just got it, yes.
Killed by dogs, mate. Policeman going in and shooting the dog and leaves it loose. Sadly true, mate.
Am I right in thinking that all that can be here are here? Yes? Lock the doors, because those that can be here are here. So the question is that Mr Barr's amendment be agreed to. Clerk.
Mr Barr?
Yes.
Ms Berry?
Yes.
Ms Birch?
Yes.
Ms Jane?
Yes.
Ms Cody?
Yes.
Mr Coe?
No.
Mr Dospot? Mrs Dunn?
No.
Ms Fitzharris?
Yes.
Mr Gentleman?
Yes.
Mr Hanson?
No.
Mrs Jones?
No.
Mrs Pickett?
No.
Ms Lauder?
No.
Ms Lakuta?
Yes.
Ms Lee?
No.
Mr Milligan? Ms Orr?
Yes.
Mr Parton?
No.
Mr Pedersen? Mr Ramsey?
Yes.
Mr Rattenbury?
Yes.
Mr Steele? Ms Stephen-Smith?
Yes.
Mr Wall?
No.
The result of the division is ayes 12, noes 9. Therefore, it is resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Clerk.
Private Members' Business Notice number 3.
Ms Cody.
I move the motion standing in my name on the notice paper relating to the services provided by government.
The question is that that motion be agreed to. Ms Cody.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise today to highlight the achievements of this government in the years since the 2016 ACT election. 12 months is not such a long period of time, Madam Speaker, but what this government has delivered is remarkable. Summarising all this is no small task, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about how their electorates have seen improved amenities and services since this government was elected to a historic 7th term. Whether it be upgrades to local libraries or schools, or building new transport infrastructure to ease congestion into the future, rolling out green waste bins, or introducing free off-peak bus rides for seniors. This is a government with a vision, a government that leads and that builds. And my electorate of Murrumbidgee has witnessed firsthand some of what this government has committed. Dog owners, like myself, bookworms, community groups and public transport junkies are some of the people that have benefited from these commitments. With Canberra's population projected to increase significantly over the next 20 years to over 500,000 people, it's a good thing we have a hard-working Labor government at the helm, laying the foundations to ensure our city and our community is prepared for population growth into the future. The dog lovers amongst us can rejoice at the prospect of a new, fully fenced dog park which is being constructed in Western Creek. This will cater for both small dogs and large dogs like my Ben and Charlie. For members of community groups, or for those who love a good read, the revitalisation of the Woden Library, Canberra's busiest library, will deliver improved meeting room facilities and make learning and reading a more enjoyable and enriching experience. We're also making our city greener by delivering on our commitment to trial the rollout of green bins and collection services in Chapman, Duffy, Fisher, Holder, Rivette, Stirling, Weston, Warramanga and Canberra. And we have come a long way in creating a vibrant and integrated travel network with diverse options to lift physical participation. With a citywide focus on building active travel, the ACT government is finding innovative ways to encourage activity through transport integration such as bike riding and walking. Because this ACT Labor government recognises that a comprehensive, diverse and fully integrated transport plan is key to improving lifestyle and keeping Canberra the healthiest city in Australia. Earlier this year, I had the great pleasure of launching the Park and Pedal scheme at the National Arboretum site. This allows commuters to combine their drive with an enjoyable cycle to Woden, Civic or Belconnen for work or pleasure. Speaking of cycling, last week my colleague Mr Steele and I launched Bike Stops in Canberra. Bike stops are where local businesses provide a range of facilities for bike riders or cyclists, both local and visitors. Some of the types of facilities offered by each business might include access to toilets, showers and change rooms, bag storage, water refill, tyre pumps, and even some facilities, like Pushies in Fyshwick, are offering hairdryers. I, of course, am very keen on having access to a hairdryer after cycling. No one likes helmet hair. And if you've been along Athlon Drive recently, you'll notice that the new park and ride facility in Warniassa is coming along at a great rate of knots. And pickup amongst users is great. Park and ride is just another way that this government is making our city healthier and offering cost-saving commuting options for Canberrans looking to save money and get fit at the same time. Now, let's not forget that this government is continuing to invest in connecting Murrumbidgee with the rest of Canberra through building the transport infrastructure of the future. The new Green Rapid Line, with a bus every 15 minutes, connects thousands of Murrumbidgee commuters each day to their jobs in the Parliamentary Triangle or Civic. And we've committed to building Stage 2 of light rail to Woden. This project makes a strong contribution to ensuring Canberra is one of the most livable and connecting cities through smart public transport. Stage 2 of light rail will allow those in Canberra South easier access to major educational institutions, retail and entertainment precincts, and employment hubs on an integrated public transport network. As a city-shaping project, light rail helps to promote the ACT nationally and internationally as a great place to visit, live, invest and study. In planning for our city's growth, reducing congestion requires an efficient, integrated and reliable public transport system. Upgrades to our existing bus network, expanding our park and ride facilities and investing in light rail are all part of this government's plans to make the Canberra we love even better. We are also a city of young families and new suburbs, and that's why we're focusing on building core educational infrastructure for the future. By investing in new schools, expanding existing school infrastructure, and developing the teaching workforce needed for the future, we're ensuring Canberra is ready for the projected population growth. And can I remind you, Madam Speaker, all of these achievements have taken place while this government is returning the budget to a strong and sustainable position and ensuring a strong basis to continue to deliver on our election commitments. Now, that's a government I'm happy to be part of.
Question is that Ms Cody's motion be agreed to. Mr Coe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The opposition not at all surprised that we would have this self-congratulatory motion put forward by the government. But of course, there are, I believe, many points in this motion that are contentious and many that I think simply have been spun to not actually reflect the real state of play here in the Territory. In particular, if one looks at the public education, where the minister or the member has said that investing in better public education by funding new schools to accommodate more students and expanding facilities at existing schools. Of course, the ACT government already invests more than all the states in public schools. However, on a per-student basis, we really are not getting the return on that investment that I think many parents would want. Increased funding alone does not correlate to increased educational performance, and that is quite simply the case here in the Territory, where there is an incredible amount of money that is going into education, but unfortunately the trends in international mathematics and science studies and the Program for International Student Assessment all indicate lower academic achievements. So there is considerable work that has to be done here. It's not simply about spending money, it's about spending money wisely and making sure that we're equipping our teachers to be able to do what they do best. The Auditor-General's performance information in public schools revealed that the ACT public schools perform below similar schools in other jurisdictions, despite expenditure on a per-student basis for public schools being the highest in the nation. That is according to the Auditor-General's report of May 2017. TIM's result also showed the ACT was down in 3 out of 4 areas than when the tests were last conducted in 2011. In actual fact, the result that's just been achieved is a lower academic result than in 1995. Further to this, there are still many questions about the capacity of our schools, and especially in some districts. We have still 73 demandable classrooms across Canberra's public schools, making up 130 classrooms. Further to this, the government still has not shed any light as to how they're actually going to address the issues in eastern Gungahlin, particularly in and around Franklin and Harrison with regard to school capacity, particularly at a primary school level. We also see in the motion that the government is bragging about constructing an integrated transport system across Canberra that will prevent the congestion affecting other cities, incorporate active and diverse travel options while also building healthier lifestyles. Well, unfortunately, the people in Mitchell who trade in Mitchell may not necessarily agree with that one, and I think for good reason. We are, of course, seeing considerable delays right across Canberra with regard to roadworks. But even with regard to this integrated transport model, whilst we did hear last week about some of the proposed changes to the rapid routes, what we still haven't seen is how they're actually going to integrate light rail with the bus system. What are actually going to be the local services that feed into the tram system? What are actually going to be the local buses running in Ngunnawal, Amaroo, Casey, Taylor, Ford, Bonner, Palmerston, Crace, Nichols, etc.? How are these suburbs actually going to be integrated with light rail? It is a very important body of work that has not yet been published, and that is actually the integration that's required. What we've heard previously and what we heard last week was about new rapid routes. And I think rapid bus travel is certainly part of Canberra's future, has been part of our past. But that's actually not an integrated transport model. These rapid routes are largely independent routes that don't actually integrate with light rail, with 1 or 2 exceptions that go through Dixon. So the real challenge is actually going to be how the local services in the inner north and in Gungahlin and also in eastern Belconnen actually do interact with light rail, because that, I think, is actually going to make or break light rail. Of course, it's happening now, and we all have an interest in it being as good as it possibly can be. But to date, how is it actually going to work for people in Lyneham, people in Downer, people in Watson, people in Hackett, people in Kaleen and Girlang, and all the other Belconnen suburbs? Because if those transfers are not perfect, if there are not safe transfers from bus onto tram, then it's going to cause problems. So there are real issues. So it's all very well for the government to talk about constructing an integrated transport system, but to date we haven't actually seen what the genuine integration of light rail is going to be. We also see the government's providing essential and affordable local healthcare where people need it and investing in a health system that prepares for the future. That's what the motion states anyway. However, unfortunately, so much of our health infrastructure is almost literally crumbling, and if not crumbling, being taken down because it is not safe. ACOM's Infrastructure Asset Condition Report and Minor Works Priorities report into the ACT Health Infrastructure revealed 4 extreme and 143 infrastructure risks at the Canberra Hospital. One of these identified risks was the main electrical switchboard at the Canberra Hospital that caught fire in April this year, causing a partial shutdown because the government failed to undertake urgent electrical repairs. I'm pleased that they're finally onto this, but I think we are all fortunate that the fire didn't have catastrophic consequences, because in some circumstances I could imagine that such a fire would cause them. We also see the government is bragging about improving public recreational spaces, including playgrounds, sporting ovals and dog parks. Well, unfortunately, given the increasing rates, fees, taxes and charges that Canberrans are paying, I don't think we actually are getting comparable increases in local services, especially local urban services. The fact, for instance, Higgins, we saw a story, Higgins residents joined forces signing a petition urging the government to provide basic improvements to the local playground that are neglected paths, no lighting, a lack of rubbish bins, a broken bubbler and a lack of bus shelters. This is a story, unfortunately, right across Canberra. Canberra, for years, had this reputation for having first-class urban services, and I don't think you could necessarily say the same for today. Whilst the people working in TAMS are doing a great job and we take our hat off to them, unfortunately they're stretched and they simply do not have the capacity that I'm sure that they would like. We also, of course, with regard to these urban services, have a very serious issue with regard to dog attacks in the ACT. And that is, of course, timely given the tragic events of today in the inner north. We've already flagged that there are serious questions to ask about that particular issue. But it's also worth noting that in 2016, there are 155 people that presented to an ACT Public Hospital Emergency Department as a result of dog attacks. 155. That is a staggering number. The year before, or in 2014, it was 84. This is a huge number of people. So we do have to make sure that the urban services are delivered properly. And that means actually empowering the people who are capable and able to do this to actually do it. There are, of course, numerous other things that the government has claimed in this motion with regard to balancing the budget and numerous other financial claims. Of course, this year, the 2017-18 budget, residential rates are up 12%, commercial rates are up 5%, land tax is up 18%, motor vehicle registration is up 6%, parking fines are up a whopping 38%. This is all compounding as well. This isn't just 1 year in isolation. This is 1 year on the back of years of solid increases, especially with regard to residential commercial rates and also land tax. So that increase of 12% is very much a deal breaker for so many Canberrans. Not only that, it's a budget breaker as well. Unfortunately, the ACT government still spends more than it receives. And I know that the government has got this grand plan to return to surplus. In actual fact, they claim that they're even in surplus now. But of course, when you include all the incomings and all the outgoings, the deficit for 2017-18 is $485 million. And that is the bottom line in the Territory Operating Statement in Budget Paper 3 on page 377 and 378. That is the actual bottom line for the Territory in terms of incomings and outgoings, far from the balanced budget that the government might claim. The ACT will be home to 425,000 residents by 2020, and the government is preparing for this population growth by investing in the infrastructure and services needed into the future. Well, as I said earlier this year, the Auditor General found in her report with regard to maintenance of selected road infrastructure assets that roads in the Territory were in an appalling state. To quote from the report, ageing road assets and budget limitations have resulted in a backlog of road pavement repairs. Addressing the backlog will likely take years and is best guided by a long-term strategy which needs to be developed. Unfortunately, this strategy has been too long in the coming. The government also claims that they're building a progressive and welcoming city that leaves no one behind. Well, unfortunately, we have a vindictive government that takes pleasure in leaving some people behind. It's a vindictive government that takes pleasure in leaving people who support the greyhound industry behind. It's a vindictive government that takes pleasure in leaving people in the clubs industry behind. It's a vindictive government that takes pleasure in leaving tens of thousands of people in a vulnerable position because of the ever-increasing cost of living in the ACT, especially with regard to rates and land tax. And let's not forget that the government is, of course, willing to do special deals for themselves. We know that there was an 8 townhouse complex in Braddon that paid $240,000 in lease variation charge. Meanwhile, the Labor Club didn't pay a cent for their 36 apartments on the same street. And of course, the special deals don't stop there. We know about the $300 million sweetheart agreement that Icon Water has with Actu-AGL, which is, of course, a tremendous gift to the other partners of Actu-AGL. We know about the CFMEU headquarters and all the other rorts and rip-offs that have happened here in the ACT. So, whilst Canberra is a great place and we all love this city, it's not to say that we can't make it even better. And unfortunately, I don't think the government's actions over the last year have contributed to Canberra becoming a better place.
Question is the motion be agreed to, Mr Barr.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank Ms Cody for bringing forward this motion. I took the opportunity yesterday in the chamber to outline a series of significant commitments that the government has delivered on in the year following the 2016 territory election. The commitments we took to the election focused on health, on education, on transport and better services for the community. And over the past year, we have been making the Canberra we love even better by building better schools, constructing an integrated transport system across the city, providing essential healthcare where and when people need it, and supporting our community with even better services, Madam Speaker. And right across the Canberra community, we've been getting on with the job that we were elected to do. It was very clear in the 2016 election, the commitments that we took to the people of Canberra and what this government would deliver if re-elected, and we are getting on with that, delivering significant school upgrades, particularly in the fastest growing parts of the city, providing more rapid bus routes across Canberra, undertaking more municipal services, weeding, mowing, cleaning of our suburbs. We're investing in community services and in the renewal of our city's public housing stock. We continue our steady progress towards being powered 100% by renewable energy by 2020. The ACT government continues its focus on economic development, and in that context, today's announcement by Lonely Planet of Canberra being in the top 10, in fact number 3 in must-see destinations, cities to visit in 2018, will be a significant boost to our already rapidly expanding tourism and hospitality industry. It's long overdue recognition for Canberra, and we are delighted after more than a decade of work in the tourism portfolio in partnership with the local tourism industry, where we've seen record levels of investment into the territory tourism economy, and the ACT government has played its part through the investment in new tourism infrastructure, in new attractions, and in supporting our tourism industry, better transport connections to Canberra. It's great to see that independent recognition from an organisation like Lonely Planet. I think this will be a very significant step forward towards our city's Tourism 2020 goals that we were already on track to achieve. I want to spend a moment now, Madam Speaker, focusing on my own electorate of Kurrajong, where the government's progressive agenda is being delivered. We have established the City Renewal Authority to create a city centre that we can all be proud of, a city centre befitting of Australia's capital city, and indeed a city that's going to have a significant increase in both national and international visitors through 2018. Through government investment in Hague Park, in better public transport, in city centre upkeep and maintenance, and through preservation and enhancement of heritage buildings within the city precinct, we are seeing significant private sector engagement with the government's renewal agenda for Canberra. We're helping people get around the inner city through opening a new public transport interchange in Dixon, introducing the new green rapid bus service through the inner south to the city, and numerous upgrades to walking and cycling infrastructure in the inner south and the inner north of the city. We're improving public amenity through providing bike racks in Braddon. The first stage of the West Basin Parks and Boardwalk will be open early in 2018, and there have been new nature play spaces delivered in Barton and O'Connor that bring the bush to our inner city suburbs. So Kurrajong, the heart of Canberra, is one example of the government's positive and progressive agenda. We will continue, Madam Speaker, to shape our city as we grow, meeting the election commitments that we took to the 2016 election. Now, I note there has been some commentary in recent times in relation to election commitments and whether the government should have a secret agenda broader than the election commitments that we took forward. The government's values are very clear. This is a progressive government that will continue to implement the policies that we have taken to successive elections. The government is focused on transport improvements, on health and education improvements, and on investing in municipal and community services. The ACT government is unique in this country in that it provides both municipal and state-level services. We will continue to reform our taxation system in order to provide the stable revenue base needed to meet the annual, monthly, weekly and daily service needs of Canberrans, as well as to invest in the infrastructure that Australia's fastest growing state or territory requires. That infrastructure investment is at all-time record levels and is rolling out right across the city, in town centres, in group centres, in local shopping centres and in the CBD. It's part of a transformative program for Canberra, an agenda that we have been progressively implementing over a number of years. And today it has been internationally recognised just how much Canberra has changed. And I want to give an assurance to everyone in this place that the government will stay the course on reform. We will continue to support the diversification of the territory's economy. We will continue to implement policies that are socially inclusive. We will be Australia's most LGBTIQ-friendly city. We will be at the forefront of social policy implementation, whether that's the rollout of the NDIS, the new carer strategy that is being developed. We will continue to invest in public and community housing and transform our city's ageing public housing stock. We will continue to invest in new and better transport infrastructure. We will continue to invest in digital technology and service provision change. Because we know this city can lead this nation, and in many areas we can be international leaders. And this is continuing to be recognised nationally and internationally by the Productivity Commission recently on tax reform, by Lonely Planet recently on our tourism and hospitality sector. We will engage productively in national debates on things like marriage equality, and we will continue to be at the forefront of inclusion. And Canberra is home to the happiest, healthiest, longest living Australians. We have the highest education levels in the country, and there is no wonder that this is the best city in the world to live in. And Ms Cody's motion today reflects that, and it reflects the good work of this government. And it contrasts, Madam Speaker, with the carping negativity of those opposite, who can barely bring themselves to say one positive thing about this city. It explains a lot about why they are in opposition, because there is so much that is positive that is happening in Canberra. And today is another example through Lonely Planet's recognition of our city. And it's a tribute to the hard work of thousands of people in our tourism and hospitality sectors, finally getting the recognition that they deserve. And it's been a great honour and a wonderful partnership to work with that industry as Tourism Minister now for 11 years. When I took over that portfolio in 2006, we set about a process of change, of reform, and to change Canberra's image. And today we've gone a long way to achieving that. Of course there is still more to do. There always is in any area of government. No job is ever complete. No project is ever perfectly implemented. There is always time and opportunity to do more and to do better. But today let's celebrate a fantastic achievement for our city. Let's celebrate all of the great successes, the achievements of Canberrans, locally, nationally and internationally. It's a wonderful opportunity today to do so. I thank Ms Cody for bringing this motion forward. I know we will continue to have carping negativity from those opposite, but we will stay the course. We will implement the policies we took to the last election and the 2012 election, and we will continue to be relentlessly positive about Canberra and our city's future. It's a city of brilliant possibilities, and we are implementing the policies that will allow Canberra to continue to grow, to continue to prosper, and to continue to be the best city in the world to live in. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank Ms Cody for her motion today.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Would I be right to assume it is the wish of the Assembly to suspend for lunch? That being the case, the resumption of this motion was set down for the order of an hour for later on today, and the chair will be resumed at 2:30.